So as Aaliyah said, a lot of what I've done is kind of try to study how we make organizing work and how it works in different kind of contexts, including in health. And so what I thought I would do today is just walk through some basic ideas. First, I want to start with an introduction to me and how I got into this work, why I think organizing is particularly important in the context of health, how it works, and then just provide like a little bit of evidence on what we know about what works and doesn't work. And just as a plug, I will say my co-authors and I have a book that's coming out in this summer that is going to synthesize a lot of these messages called Prisons of the People. So just can't help plugging that book as well. But let me start with a little introduction about me. So I grew up as a daughter of Korean immigrants in Texas. My parents were refugees from North Korea during the Korean War, migrated south, and then eventually moved to the United States before I was born. So I was born in the U.S. And, because of like that generation of Koreans who immigrated, many of them, even if they were college educated, came here and their money didn't go very far in the United States because Korea was still a developing economy at the time. So my dad delivered Chinese food and my mom cleaned people's houses. And a lot of what I saw as my parents were growing up was the effort that my parents made to just try to make it in the United States. My family was very apolitical. Politics wasn't something we talked about at the dinner table. But I think the lesson that I learned from the experience of being the child of immigrants is the idea that transformation is fundamental to what we do as humans, right? That it's not only possible, but it's a way of life. That what we do as humans is we try to remake ourselves so that we can remake our families, so that we can remake the world around us. And it's that lesson, I think, that really stayed with me, that made it no accident that I got into studying organizing and movements, because I think what appealed to me when I learned about organizing in college as a student organizer is that part of what makes it different from other forms of social change is that movement building or organizing, which I'm going to use those terms interchangeably, are distinct because they work through transformation, right? So organizers are not trying to sell you a product that you already want, like ketchup, right? But instead, they're trying to transform people so that we can transform the world around us. And I think that's what really spoke to me when I learned what organizing is. But then I wanted to sort of really understand kind of how it works. So that's what a lot of what I do as a professor at Johns Hopkins is really try to understand, how does organizing or movement work? How do we create the kind of vehicles through which ordinary people are able to put their hands on the levers of change, where all of us together can become architects of our own future? And I think that's what really organizing is about. So why do I think that it's necessary for the kind of work that you all are doing in health? So I think a lot of times when people think about health, they think about health as something that is delivered to me by a doctor, right? Like my 9-year-old recently had a rash, and so I went to the doctor and I wanted the doctor to give me medicine to help my child get better, right? But I think that really what we have seen through the coronavirus pandemic and so many other things in our lives is that health really has to be something that we all create together. Like, how do we make health itself a public good, right? That we're all invested in and working together. And I think that's fundamentally why, if we think about health in that way, then we have to think about how it's also related to questions of power. So what does that mean? So let me start just by starting with this idea that there are different kind of problems that require different kind of solutions. So there's some problems that you can solve by realigning the incentives that people have, right? Like our entire tax code is basically a giant incentive system, right? We try to incentivize people to save for retirement, to make the kind of investments that we want and things like that. We have other problems that can be solved by the right information or technology. So an example that I give sometimes is that, as many of you know probably, is that doctors in the mid-20th century used to tell parents to put babies to sleep on their stomach, right? Because they thought babies slept better that way. And then discovered that, well, if you have babies sleep on their stomach, it actually can increase the rates of SIDS. So there's a whole campaign, Back to Sleep, right, where doctors now tell people to put their babies to sleep on their backs, right? And that was a situation where once we had the information, the doctors could provide that information to parents, and parents had both the motivation and the authority to determine how their children sleep, right? So as a parent, I'm highly motivated for my children to be healthy, for them to survive infancy, obviously. And so when a doctor tells me that it's more likely for them to do that when they sleep on their back, then I'm going to do that, right? Like, I'm going to act on the information that I have. Problems of power are problems where the people who need to act to make the change don't have either the motivation or the authority to act, right? And so another way to think about it is a problem of power is a situation where the people who need or want the change the most lack either the motivation or the authority to make the change that they need, right? In the situation with the parents have the motivation and the authority to act so they can make the change that we need. In problems of power, we often have situations where the people who want the change lack the authority, or those who have the authority lack the motivation to make the change they want. And so what organizing is essentially is a process of bringing motivation and authority into alignment, right? And so when I say that organizing is trying to tackle problems of power, I think sometimes people think of power as being distasteful or being problematic. But here I'm trying to say that part of what we're trying to do is say, here's a group of people who want more people to be engaged in our public life, who want more people to vote, right? But we don't have that ability to make that change ourselves. So what we have to do is work with each other to reconfigure the resources that we have to be able to make the change that we want. And you all, as healthcare providers, I think have enormous resources that can be brought to bear on this problem. So what do we learn over time then about how this kind of work works? So the challenge in a way is when you're asking people, and this is a little bit to what Aaliyah was pointing to, that when you're asking people to engage in ways that shift power, you fundamentally have to think about the relationships that you're building between people. Now, why is that? So this is just like a simple like clip art, kind of representation of it, but the idea is that power is heavy, right? And it's hard to change. And if you just get a few people on board with you, it probably won't be enough. And even if you can get a lot of people once, that usually what ends up happening is that the scales shift back to go back to sort of, because the scales always tip back to favor those who already have power, institutional power. And so the real challenge, if you want to balance the scales of power, is to figure out how do you get people to stand with you, not just once, but again and again and again and again, right? That they're not the ones who are going to jump off the scale after one big rally or one big event or just one election or something like that, right? And I, sort of, one way that I think about it is that very often in politics, what we think about is that what we're trying to generate are people who are constituents, because the root word of constituent is constare, which means to stand together, right? So I want people who are going to stand together with me, which is different from a client, because the root word of client is inclinare, which means people who lean on me, or a consumer, right? Because the root word of consumer means to burn something up, consumere, right? And so we don't want any of those things. Instead, we want people who are choosing to stand with each other. And so the question is, how do you develop that? Well, it turns out that as human beings, we are not born with the capacities and the motivations that it takes to sort of stand with each other to work towards a common good together, because naturally we're all a little bit selfish. We're all a little bit short-sighted, right? We're all a little bit limited in our ability to do those things. But it turns out that we know a lot about how you cultivate the motivations and capacities that people need to learn to work together. And so a story that I like to tell is a story about a man named Alex Waters, who is a young man who started college in the early 2000s. He grew up in Colorado, and he went to college in Iowa thinking that he was going to be a professional athlete. He wanted to be a professional golfer. He went to college on a golf scholarship, on an athletic scholarship. And in his first semester of college, he was one of his friends invited him to go to the lake house, to their family lake house for a weekend. He's like a freshman in college. He's like, what could be better? That would be awesome. Of course I want to go. So he goes to his friend's lake house, and he's standing at the end of the dock one day, and it's a little bit windy outside. He's wearing his favorite baseball cap, and the wind comes along and it blows his baseball cap off his head and it blows into the water. And he thinks, oh shoot, it's my favorite cap, right? And those of you who wear hats know that like once that hat gets fit to your head, like you don't want to let it go, right? So he thinks, I want to get that cap back. How am I going to get it back? And he looks in the water and he thinks, you know what? I'm just going to dive in. I'm going to get that cap. So he dives into the water thinking it's going to be about 18 feet deep. It turns out to be more like 18 inches deep. And so you can imagine what happened. He was instantly, broke his neck. He had to be life flighted out of there. He went home, had years of really good care. And after a few years, eventually came back to college, but he came back to college as a paraplegic, right? And so his dreams of becoming a professional golfer had ended, and he was having to remake his life. And at the time when he went back to college, there was a young man named Barack Obama who was starting to run for president. And this was back in 2007, which I don't know if any of you remember, but like no one thought Obama could win, right? And they were trying to hire organizers in Iowa, and they call up Alex and they say, because Alex had been volunteering with the campaign on his campus, and they say, hey, we want to hire you as an organizer. And he says, gosh, you know, you guys are crazy if you want to hire me as an organizer, because I can't do any of the things that organizers do. I can't walk a neighborhood. I can't knock on doors. I can't dial numbers on a phone. You know, I can't even like get my call list like off the printer in the office. Like you can't hire me as an organizer. And they said, no, like you're misunderstanding what we want you to do, because what you're thinking about is what we call mobilizing, right? Where what the organizer does is you're the person who individually reaches out to every, you know, person out there and tries to get them to vote. What an organizer does is an organizer's job instead is to inspire others to develop teams around them and people who live in the community in which you're working. And those people are the ones who are going to reach out to their neighbors. And the difference between what Alex thought he was going to do and what Alex ended up doing on the Obama campaign is a difference between what we call mobilizing and organizing, or the politics of transaction and the politics of transformation. That organizing and the kind of movements that are able to get to scale in the way that the 2008 Obama campaign was, and the way that social movements throughout history have been, depend on this logic of transformation, where the job of the organizer is not just to be like a voter turnout machine, right? But the job of the organizer instead is to be the person who cultivates the leadership and the teamwork of others. And so a lot of the research that we've done over the years has been trying to sort of differentiate what's the difference between this politics of transaction and the politics of transformation, or another way of putting it is the sort of difference between mobilizing and organizing. And essentially, you know, organizing has at its core this notion of transformative leaders, right? So as an organizer, my job is not to be the one who knocks on the most doors. Instead, my job is to be the one who inspires others to realize their own leadership and construct teams around them that enable them to sort of generate as much outreach as possible. Because it turns out that when you inspire people to build on their own organic social networks within the communities within which you're organizing, it's far more powerful than having someone from the outside come in and try to do that work. And so it turns out one of the things that we found that as we think about the difference between organizing and mobilizing, it's not just semantic, it's not just words, nor is it just philosophical. It actually has implications for the kinds of things you ask people to do, the way you structure yourself, and the way you organize your work. So organizers, because they're constantly sort of thinking about how we transform people to take on the leadership that we need, they're constantly asking people to do things that put them into relationship with others, right? Because people are not transformed alone. We're only transformed in relationship with others. And so they're constantly thinking not how do I get one person to do one thing, but how do I get someone to do something in a way that's going to force them to work with somebody else. What that means is that often, you know, organizing campaigns are structured in ways that are really decentralized, so that each team has its autonomy to sort of develop its own work. And the basis for action is really one of shared interest and self-governance. So that's why the teams are so powerful, because when people feel like they have autonomy over developing strategy about their own work, they're far more likely to sort of stay involved over time. And so what we see is that the difference between sort of the politics of transaction and politics of transformation, or mobilizing and organizing, is that the momentum is generated from having lots of people who are organized in teams work together. And as those teams that we call snowflakes begin to sort of multiply, then that's how you build the momentum of a campaign. Whereas the politics of transaction, what ends up happening is that because you have lots of individuals who are not connected to each other working together, you might get that one swell of action at one point in time, but it often turns out to fall apart afterwards, right? It often turns out to be really fragile, kind of like the image of the scales that we saw. And so the goal then is really to sort of figure out how you put people into the politics of transformation. So just one final thing that I'll say is, so some people look at this and they're like, okay, so like you're an academic. Have you ever talked to a human ever? Like it's really hard to change humans, right? And so does it actually work, right? And so let me just offer you kind of a couple, little data points on it. So, you know, there's a great sociologist named Ziad Munson who did this study of the people who are the very front lines of the pro-life movement. So he's studying people who are, these are people who protest outside clinics, who organize local groups in their communities, who attend marches and rallies and organize marches and rallies and so on and so forth. And he had this really interesting finding, because what he found was that while most people think that the kind of people who join the pro-life movement are people who are pro-life, right? So when we think about who joins the pro-life movement, we think people who support pro-life issues, right? Who joins the environmental movement? People who support environmental issues. who's going to support me in wanting to vote? People who want to vote anyway, right? Well, it turns out that what Ziad Munson found in his study of people who are at the front lines of pro-life movement is that 47% of them, when they first joined the movement, they were either pro-choice or indifferent to issues of abortion when they first joined the movement, right? That like what draws people in is belonging, and belonging often comes before belief. And I think a mistaken identity, a mistaken belief that we often have is this idea that belief has to come first and then belonging comes afterwards. And the movements that are the most successful usually find that you start with belonging and then belief will often flow from that. Not always, right? 50% of people already believed in pro-life issues when they started the movement, but in many cases, that's sort of what happens. And so I'll just close with sort of one final story that I just want to share with you. And so this is a personal story. So in 2010, my husband and I are expecting our second child, and this child is named Kason. And he was named after Kaesong, which is a small, tiny town that is on the demilitarized zone on the border between North Korea and South Korea. It's a town where the ceasefire negotiations to end the Korean War began, but ultimately failed. And my grandparents were North Korean refugees who had fled south during the war. And Kaesong turned out to be the last place where my grandfather saw his mother. After the war ended, the border was shut and Korea was split into two countries. He never saw his mother again. And so in our family, the name Kason reminds us that peace or justice is a struggle, right? And it was a really apt name for our son because despite having a very healthy pregnancy and carrying him with me for 9 months, for reasons that doctors still don't understand, our son died right at birth. And I tell you that story because it was really, when I was in the hospital, it was the healthcare providers that were with me in that moment that got me and my family through that trauma and through that experience. And 16 months after Kason died in 2011, my husband and my oldest daughter and I were fortunate to welcome our third child and our youngest son into the world. And I think all three of us welcomed him into our family with a much keener understanding than ever before of the fragility and the magnitude of the gift that we had been given with his life. And I tell you that story this morning because I want to underscore the enormous power that you all have as healthcare providers to touch people in the most profound ways. Nowadays, 10 years later, I still carry a recording of the sound of my son's heartbeat on my phone, and I listen to it often. And I listen to it because one of the core lessons that I learned from the research that I just described to you, which I was doing all around the time that I was pregnant with and lost Kason, is that our power comes not from the money that we raise, the messages that we craft, or anything like that. It comes from the hearts that we have, the hearts that beat the center of who we are, the heartbeat that we have to keep at the center of our work. And I'm a social scientist and I believe in data and experiments and numbers and all these kind of things to think about what's working and what's not working. But I also really believe in people. And I think sometimes we end up in these conversations in medicine, in health, in politics, where it feels like there's a dichotomy between the data that we provide, the science that we can provide, and the heart that's in the work, and that it's an either or. And I think one of the big lessons that I've learned, not only from experiences like the experience of losing my son, but also the experience of doing all this research with so many movements that have done so much work around the world, is that that it's a false dichotomy, essentially. There's no dichotomy between data-driven and being rigorous and building power or putting people's dignity at the center of our work. And I think that what I've learned most from our research is that our power comes from our humanity, and whether we can build the power we need for the change that we need depends on whether or not we organize people in a way that fundamentally recognizes their humanity. And I think what I learned from losing our son is that I can love someone that I don't know. And I think that's a really powerful capacity as humans that we have to put at the center of our work, that I know that all of you put at the center of your work in working with your patients. And so I hope you bring that into this work also. So I'll just close with one of my favorite quotes, who's from a Jewish theologian who once said that hope is belief in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable. And I think one of the things that we found in working with so many organizers around the world is that if we don't have people organizing in the ways that we describe, then what ends up happening is that the necessity of the probable is always what wins, right? That we just sort of accept the world as it is instead of helping to realize the world as it could be. And what I hope that I think part of what's wonderful about what Vot-ER is trying to do is trying to sort of cultivate a whole generation of leaders who are trying to make more plausible the world that is possible. And so I thank you for letting me come and talk with you all today, and look forward to the rest of the conversations.
Wow. Hahrie, that was incredible as always. Really, really, really profound lessons. And I hope you all have begun to think about this relationship between you and your power that you have to create change on a systemic level. In many ways, Vot-ER, before we met Hahrie and before we started to learn about the incredible work of organizing, was really focused on mobilizing. And I think back to the image that Hahrie had with the two scales. I think if we stayed there, the impact of just mobilizing alone would have been a fraction of what we can do now. And as Vot-ER focuses more on the organizing work and builds power, we really commend you, Hahrie, for teaching us, in many ways being the godmother of this work. We've read effectively like every one of her books, and we will be reading Prisms of Power during our organizing book club. So thank you very, very, very much.